featured speaker, Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II, whose work I was first introduced to as a part of a Lasallian higher education colloquy, where we focused on racial justice. Since that time, many of Dr. Barber's philosophies and works have been at the forefront of my heart and my mind, whereas they influence how I serve at Lewis and the local community. So yes, it is a large reason on why we are commemorating Black History Month with his presence. So bear with me as I read his bio, as he is a man of distinguished and distinctive accolades and accomplishments. Dr. Barber is the president and senior lecturer of Repairs of the Breach, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, bishop with the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary, pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church, Disciples of Christ in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and author of 4 books. He is the architect of the Moral Movement, which began with weekly Moral Monday protests at the North Carolina General Assembly in 2013, and recently relaunched again online in August of 2020 under the banner of the Poor People's Campaign. In 2018, Dr. Barber helped relaunch the Poor People's Campaign, which was begun by Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, starting with a historic wave of protests in state capitals and in Washington, D.C., calling for a moral agenda and a moral budget to address the 5 interlocking injustices of systemic racism, systemic poverty, the war economy and militarism, ecological devastation, and the false moral narrative of Christian nationalism. There are currently 45 state coordinating committees across the country mobilizing around the Poor People's Jubilee platform, and we must do more. On June 20th, 2020, approximately 2.5 million people tuned in on Facebook alone for the campaign's Mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington, which originally was scheduled as an in-person event, but switched to digital because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thousands of others, though, watched and listened on C-SPAN and other media. A highly sought after speaker, Dr. Barber has given keynote addresses at hundreds of national and state conferences, including the 2016 Democratic National Convention. He has spoken to a wide variety of audiences, and so again, we're fortunate that he's here with us today. This includes national unions, fraternities, sororities, drug dealer redemption conferences, women's groups, economic policy groups, voting rights advocates, LGBTQIA equality and justice groups, environmental and criminal justice groups, small organizing committees of domestic workers, and national gatherings of Christians, Muslims, Jews, and other people of faith. Dr. Barber served as president of the North Carolina NAACP, the largest state conference in the South, from 2006 to 2017, and served on the national NAACP board of directors. He is a former Mel King Fellow at MIT and is a senior fellow at Auburn Seminary. Dr. Barber is regularly featured on media outlets such as MSNBC, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, and the National Magazine, among others. He is also the 2015 recipient of the Puffin Award. Dr. Barber was named one of 2020's BET 100 Entertainers and Innovators as a social justice warrior. He has also received the Franklin D. Roosevelt Four Freedoms Award. He is a 2018 MacArthur Foundation Genius Award recipient, and he is one of the 2019 recipients of the North Carolina Award, the state's highest civilian honor. On January 21st of this year, 2021, Dr. Barber delivered the homily at the National Inaugural Prayer Service for President Biden and Vice President Harris. Before we hear his voice, let us turn our attention to one of his many efforts by way of video. Ryan, will you please share our video?
I worked 41 years in the coal mines. I have black lung, and it's just unfathomable what these poor coal miners have to go through in order to get what they have worked for and deserve.
At one time, poverty was a temporary condition. You were on a down slope for a minute, but you could bounce back up. We can't bounce back up today. It's permanent. We're not going back to the factory and building cars and trucks like we once did.
A job working at McDonald's or the grocery store doesn't pay enough for one person to live.
We work a 40-hour work week, still not enough. Living from paycheck to paycheck. Rent is $600 a month. We got water bill, electricity. I do this for my kids, and it hurts.
I'm 46 years old. I've lived in poverty here in West Virginia every day of my life. And I'm working. I am working poor with a bachelor's degree. I'm doing the best I can with what I have.
We were in the height of mass water shutoffs. This entire neighborhood was shut off all at one time.
I saw all my neighbors get shut off right in front of me. It was kind of terrifying.
I'm 42 years old, and I'm a cashier at McDonald's. I had lost my house. You're welcome to come inside. There's a lot of people that are living in their cars. You never notice until you're in the same situation.
I don't have stuff to give my children. I'm paying all these bills, and they need school clothes and stuff. They be asking me for it, I can't give it to them.
Now I'm a Kansas farmer's wife. Kansas farmers are committing suicide. Why? They're usually in debt up to their eyeballs.
I see poverty in my own community. You know, there's a 70% unemployment rate in the reservation right now.
Here in New York City, we're home to millionaires and billionaires, and we have so many people living in the street, and that's just not right.
I've been a homeless veteran twice, lived in a shelter.
I've been living down here since I was 17.
My only chance of going to college was joining the Army. We are demanding that we stop the war on our poor.
700,000 people in this country are on the verge of losing their food stamps.
This budget calls for shrinking the social safety net programs like Medicare.
I just know that everything that's happening to us isn't right.
I'm in stage 5 of kidney disease. I fell behind on my health care, and they canceled my health insurance, and they told me I have to wait until open enrollment. There's only 5 stages of kidney disease, and I'm in the 5th stage. Murder, it's murder. You know, if you ask me, it's murder.
I lost a son to gun violence, and I lost a daughter.
No parent should have, in America, should have to bury their child for a lack of medical space.
I'm wailing because my children,
my God,
are no more.
My God, Kevin.
I'm wailing, y'all. Wailing, cause my babies ain't no more. How many more babies? How many more children?
No more.
Dr. Barber, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much.
Can you hear me well now?
Yes, we can.
Great. And Dr. Kelly, thank you for all your work you do. I want to first of all say that our movement is about the people that you just saw. They make the movement. They are the leaders in the movement. And I'm just honored to serve. And I'm honored to share here today with your particular university, Lewis University. I understand some things about it. I see that A Catholic almost right behind you, right? A Catholic, and what does it say? A Catholic and something on there. But it's right behind on your background. But we certainly are thankful for my dear friends in Illinois with the NAACP. I want to try to talk today about Black history in a contemporary sense. I don't want to do something and talk about, Fannie Lou Hamer, Meredith McLeod Bethune, and because too often I think we have speeches where people talk about Black history as just remembering the past. We are still impacted in America because of history and because of so much of the history that we never fully addressed. Let me give your audience one example as we begin today. I hear a lot of people saying about January the 6th, we've never seen anything like this before. This is only the second time in history that we saw extremists, insurrectionists attack the Capitol. It's not true. We've seen this kind of mob violence too many times before. Whether it was the mobs that attacked the women's suffrage movement, the mobs that attacked the abolitionists, the mobs that attacked those who were in the Underground Railroad, the mobs that attacked the early civil rights movement in the 1900s, mobs that attacked the union movement, the mobs and those that killed people during the civil rights movement. I think sometimes we forget that all of our leaders were killed or isolated. And it's because we have a kind of selective memory, a kind of selective amnesia, is why we often keep repeating some of the same realities. Someone said, we've never seen language like Trump used. We've never seen that. Have you read the language that was used during the debate on the 13th Amendment in 1865? Have people ever sat down and gone through that? Like, do you know what they called Abraham Lincoln? Abraham Africanus Lincoln. And they put portraits of him looking like a monkey with a tail to suggest he was Black, suggest that's why he was doing what he was doing. Have we forgotten that they beheaded, what was his name? He was at Harper's Ferry, who long before Frederick Douglass, John Brown. Do we not remember? Do we not remember that they called Dr. King Martin Luther King? That when the Supreme Court ruled in 1954 to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, do we not remember that there were riots in the streets? That one of the groups that was led by the daddy of the Koch brothers called for the impeachment of President Eisenhower, a Republican, and the Supreme Court justice who had been appointed by a Republican when there was a unanimous vote. I sometimes wonder why we choose to act as though what we're seeing is new. It's new people, but what we're seeing is what always happens when you spew lies and untruths and you mix it with narcissistic, egotistical human beings that want simply power. We say the country is divided now. Really now? We say this all happened in the last 4 years. Do we not remember the history that said right at the end of the Civil Rights era in 1968, Richard Nixon, Kevin Phillips, Pat Buchanan, and Howard Dent got in a room and came up with a political theory called positive polarization? And they said, it's written in a book by Jonathan Shell called The Great Illusion, The Time of Illusion, that if we can fool people, if we can figure out a way to talk about racism without sounding racist, we can divide the country and we will end up with the better half of it. But we can intentionally divide the country, and through that division, we can control the country. So a lot of what we see now is not something that just began a few years ago. It's not even un-American. It's not American as insofar as what Dr. King often said, the high blood pressure of our creeds. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all persons, men are created equal. You know, that the high blood pressure of our creeds, one nation under God, indivisible liberty. He said, but too often we've had the anemia of deeds. And because of those two realities, what we see is not American in terms of what we have promised, but is a very American in the way we have performed. And so it's not just about remembering history. It's not about just going backwards. It's about what does that history say to us now? And what is it in this contemporary moment do we need to address so that years from now when people write the record, hopefully they will see something different. I was one time challenged a group of senators and legislators who, when John Lewis was alive, they used to love to get on the bus and go on the Freedom Trail with John Lewis. They'd get on the bus and they would come down to Selma. They would walk across the Emmons Pettus Bridge and they would say, ooh, the people back then were so courageous. And one time in a meeting we said, and they would say, and we respect them. And so one time we asked, wait a minute, excuse me, how do you respect them if you come and walk across the Emmons Pettus Bridge, but then when you go back to Washington, D.C., you pass voter suppression laws? You know, and we had to challenge this kind of thinking you can play with our history, right? You can say on the one hand, you love those folk in the past, like what happens every Martin Luther King Day. Folk that get on the stage and say they loved Dr. King would not be seen on the stage if he was alive. And when you start actually pressuring them, they actually don't even love the policies he stands for. But you know, one poem says Dr. King is a convenient hero because he's dead. And even the Bible says in Matthew 23, the great ugliness often is too many people love the tombs of the prophets. They don't love living prophets. I would never dare call myself a prophet, but I do try to do prophetic inquiry. And in that vein, let me try to do a little bit now in this talk about history and race and where we are. Last year, then candidate Joe Biden addressed a virtual assembly of the Poor People's Campaign. 1.4 million people were on the line. And he promised that ending poverty would be more than an aspiration if he were to become the 46th president of the United States. He said it would be a theory of change to build a new economy that works for everyone. And he was reminded that our reiteration of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, grows out of the original Poor People's Campaign that was actually pushed to be launched by the welfare rights women. It wasn't Dr. King, it was the welfare rights women. They pushed Dr. King, you know, because oftentimes we don't tell the truth about women either in history. They were the ones that pushed Dr. King to do the Poor People's Campaign, just like they were the ones that pushed Dr. King to speak out against Vietnam. And it was welfare rights women, it was Jewish Federation, it was indigenous Native Americans, and it was Latinos, people like Cesar Chavez, and it was white people from Appalachia. Never forget that. Because by the time you got to the original Poor People's Campaign, when Dr. King launched it, here's the truth we have to deal with. We're going to deal with history. He was an outsider. He had been, when he gave his speech April 3rd, 1967, saying that racism, poverty, and militarism were the three triune evils that would destroy America. After that speech, 160 newspapers wrote articles against him, including the biggest ones, the Times, Post, and others. The president, the White House took his invitation, his open invitation to the White House. Now here's something we don't often talk about. Major civil rights organizations, including the NAACP at that time, wrote resolutions against his stance. So by the time he launches the Poor People's Campaign in December of '67, He's out. His own denomination put him out. A black denomination. And he was organizing with poor people and anti-war activists and religious leaders, who many of them who had been put on the outsides of their denomination. And before he can get to DC, he gets shot. But the last night he was with us, some people say that speech was entitled, "I've Been to the Mountaintop." No, that was a closing that he had used many places. The actual speech was, "Nothing would be more tragic than for us to stop at this point." That was the actual speech. And we reminded then candidate Joe Biden, now president, we said to him that the only way to address poverty in this country is we must grab something from our history and make it present. That is, we must have a third Reconstruction that brings together what we call a fusion coalition today of black and white and brown, indigenous and Asian, and young and old and gay and straight, and people from Appalachia to Alabama. Now, why did we use that language of Reconstruction when we talked to the now president? Why? Because you cannot discuss or understand Black history without knowing the impact of the first Reconstruction and the second Reconstruction. The first Reconstruction happened between 1868 and ran to about 1890s, and that is when Black and white people in the South, all over the South after the Civil War, came together and formed political coalitions and changed the South and rewrote constitutions and implemented public education, changed criminal justice laws and implemented voting rights and passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Now that coalition was undermined by an effort called the Redemption Movement. And guess what their motto was? We have to make America great again. We have to undermine all this black and white working together. They're just doing too many progressive things. It's just too liberal. And so they ended it around 1890s. And then there was a second Reconstruction. I can't do all the history in this speech, in between 1954 and 1968. And that was the second Reconstruction. We call it the Civil Rights Movement, from the Brown decision that ended Plessy versus Ferguson all the way to the Fair Housing decision in 1968. And it was black and white people coming together in the Civil Rights Movement, led out of the South. And Dr. King said in 1965, at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, he said, every time there's the possibility of black and white people coming together, poor black and white people coming together to restructure America and create the beloved community, he said the aristocracy, the greedy, sowed division, intentionally sowed division. They did it to end the first Reconstruction, and they are doing it, he said, today. But you cannot understand the positive advancement in the black community, and whenever the black community has advanced, it has helped the white community as well, and the brown community. There's not one law that has been passed to deal with racism that did not also have a positive and sometimes a greater impact on white people, poor white people, white women. White women couldn't sit on juries until the Civil Rights Act was passed. The Voting Rights Act was passed. You wouldn't have women in sports without the Civil Rights Act and Title IX, I believe. We have to remember these things. White men could not vote, that did not own land, could not vote until the 15th Amendment. They could not vote. And so every movement of Reconstruction, transformation, and what we're saying is today we have to have a third Reconstruction, which is not just about policy, but it's about the diversity of people that come together and shape policy and lift this nation from the bottom up. And Reconstruction is not easy. But today in America right now, we have to have a third Reconstruction, because before COVID, we had 140 million people living in poverty and low wealth. We had 250,000 people, 700 a day, dying from poverty before COVID. We had 62 million people working for less than a living wage before COVID, 87 million people either uninsured or underinsured before COVID, 4 million people who get up every morning, they can buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water before COVID. Before COVID, we were putting almost $800 billion a year into the war economy 54 cents of every discretionary dollar going in the war economy, most of it going to war manufacturers and not even to the soldiers, while only 16 cents of our federal discretionary dollar is going to education, healthcare, and infrastructure before COVID. 1/3 of all the poor people in this country live in the South. 1/3 of all poor white people live in the South. There's not a county in America today, before COVID, where working a $7.25 an hour job, you can afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. Only 39% of Americans can afford an emergency of $1,000. 61% of Americans can't. 61% of Black people are poor and low wealth. Before COVID, before 8 million more people were added to poverty. Of the 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country, 66 million of them are white. 26 million are Black. But that 26 million Black represents 61% of all Black people. So you cannot talk about transformation of this society without addressing 5 issues: systemic racism in all of its form, how it affects Black people, brown people, Asian people, indigenous people, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and then this false moral narrative of religious nationalism that says as long as you are against people, as long as you're for prayer in the school, for guns, for tax cuts, that's a godly position. You don't really have to be against poverty and against the denial of health care, which we know is not only theological malpractice, it's a form of heresy. Because I know at a good Catholic institution, brothers and sisters, knowing Catholic social theology, social and political theology, you all have been taught that Jesus said to the nations, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked. He wasn't just talking to individuals, he was talking to the structures. He said, I say to the nations, the government. And so we need, in order to build, we can't even build back better unless we build back bolder. And we can't build back bolder unless we build from the bottom. And the truth is, we now have the most diverse presidential team. We got a older white man from the North and a Black woman with Indian descent. We have the most diverse cabinet in the history. We've got the Senate in the majority because of the African-American vote and the poor and low wealth vote. And we have the largest contingency of African-Americans in the United States Senate, the United States House. But even with all of that diversity, the question of whether or not we will have a third Reconstruction and whether life will get better for the majority of people will depend on the ability to work with the people for whom the system has not been working for. Now, as a preacher, this moral vision it's not about left and right and center and all these puny terms we use. I get so tired of people. This is a left position. This is a right position. This is far left. Well, let's talk about constitutional position. Every policy we should ask is, does it establish justice? Does it promote the general welfare? Does it provide for the common defense? Does it ensure domestic tranquility? Or from a biblical perspective, the prophets in Isaiah said, if you get rid of unfair practices and stop blaming victims and give to the down and out and pay people what they deserve, then a nation will be called a repairer of the breach. That's where we are now. The history, we must look at history by looking at what we have not yet completed and how incomplete our history is in terms of justice. Our history is just like that pyramid on the back of a dollar bill. It's uncompleted. If you ever looked on the back of a dollar bill, it has a pyramid, and then it has an eye at the top, and then the top. And that is a symbol that the nation is yet under construction, but the eye of God is on the nation. And we cannot build this nation where it needs to be without confessing the ways historically we have actually not done what we should have done. We've got to reject racism. We've got not only to reject the insurrection that Trump led, and not only talk about prosecuting persons who did that, we have to prosecute an agenda that will inspire people, that will lift everybody, that will address the issues of injustice. This can't just be about presidential appointments in terms of putting black faces in high places. It has to be about policy. We got to have leaders who truly try to understand what racism and poverty and war economy and ecological devastation, denial of health care is doing, and sees these things as interlocking injustices, that we don't get in this moment in history to address one without the other. That the fact of the matter is, a nation cannot exist when 43% of its people, almost 50% now since COVID, are living in poverty and low wealth. That is not a democracy. That is not the true essence of a democracy. So it's not enough to have a seat at the table. And you know, black people historically, if you go back and look, black people, and our history tells us that Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, they wanted more than freedom. They wanted full citizenship and to be treated like full human beings. They wanted more than just to be at a seat. They wanted the power to change things and to change public policy. Yes, we know right now, for instance, that COVID deaths have been disproportionately black, brown, native, and native, right? They tell us black people are 3 to 5 times more likely to contract poverty and die. But here's another piece we've got to reckon with. It's not just black people, it's poor black people, poor and low wealth black people, poor and low wealth white people, poor and low wealth brown people, people who were the first to have to go to work, the first to have to support this society. So we decided to change their name from service workers to essential workers to make them feel good about it. They were the first to do that, the first to get infected, the first to get deadly sick, the first to die. And yet even now, people want them to be the last to get vaccinated and the last to get health care and the last to get protection against their mortgages being called in and the last to get protection for their utilities and the last to get health care. We cannot function like that. That is not what Ella Baker fought for. That is not what Dr. King fought for. In fact, Dr. King said in 1968, before he died, he wrote a little book called Where Did We Go From Here? And he said, for a society, I paraphrase, for a society to continue to have the kind of poverty that we have, it is nothing more than a form of political cannibalism, economic cannibalism, where the lives of other people are being eaten alive, so that other people's pockets and other people will grow and other people's wealth will be increased. When we look at where we are now, poor and low wealth people of every race, creed, and color know that we got, in this moment, we have to do more than just say, let's just get back to before the emergency. Getting back to before COVID is not a good place. Because if you just go back to where we were before COVID, we go back to where 700 people were dying a day from poverty. We go back to where 250,000 people were dying a year from poverty. We go back to where billionaires were getting tax breaks while poor people's wages were staying stagnant. Do you realize that in this COVID, for instance, millions of people have lost their jobs, but billionaires have made $1 trillion in America? You think about that. In the middle of COVID, with everybody else suffering, billionaires have made $1 trillion. In the first COVID relief bill, there was no special set aside for black people and brown people, those who were being affected the most. No special, sure enough set aside. It was a little taste here and there. And 84% of all of that money went to corporations and banks. Not to essential workers, not to people affected, but 84%. In fact, one time, the corporations got over $1 trillion they didn't even ask for. They didn't vote on it. They didn't take it through regular order. They were just given that money from the treasury. So what do we must do in this moment? In this moment, we must have just and full COVID relief for everybody that takes into account the impact it's having on race, age, familial status, geography, even sexual orientation and immigration status. Everybody in, nobody out. In this moment, we must have a champion for guaranteed health care for all, not access to health care, because you can have access to a Rolls Royce. You can just walk on the parking lot, but you can't pay for it. And every senator gets free health care. It's the most damnable thing, I can use that word, Jesus used it. It's the most damnable thing to me to watch senators and people in the House Rep vote against people's health care when they get free health care just because they got elected. They get the best health care. They get Cadillac health care plan because they got elected. We pay for it. And how can we in this moment of history? And the last time we had this kind of attack to stop health care was when the former slave owners fought to tear down the Freedmen Bureau hospitals that had been put in place after slavery to, in fact, ensure health care for Black people, former slaves, and poor white people. No, no, no. We have to have health care for all in this moment. Imagine what COVID, the impact COVID would not have had if we had had health care for everybody before COVID. Columbia University says that 60% of the people that have died, 60% of 500,000, that's 300,000 people. Maybe more, didn't have to die. They did not have to die if we had had wages and if we didn't have the kind of racial fights against raising the minimum wage, because raising the minimum wage to a living wage has a racist context to it, a fear. If we had had health care for everybody. And we've got to, that's why this whole battle about increasing the minimum wage, if you want to talk about history, this whole thing about increasing the minimum wage to 15, it's about racial and economic equity. You cannot even say that you believe in dealing with racial disparities and you say what you're going to do is have police reform and prison reform. Those are just two parts of racism. That's not the whole. Racism and economic injustice go together. Dr. King and the March on Washington called for a $2 minimum wage in 1963. Do you know what $2 minimum wage would be? Those are the listed. If it had been implemented then and it had been indexed with inflation, $15 an hour. So we talk about 15 today, we're 57 years too late. 57 years too late. $15 today would lift 49 million people out of poverty and pump $360 billion into the economy. You cannot talk about it. I've said to the president, said to Schumer, said to the Democrats, particularly like the Democrats ran on 15 and now they're saying, well, maybe we don't need 15, maybe we need 12, maybe we need 11. You try living off of that. Corporate wages have gone up 15. The fact of the matter, if we really want to be honest about this, and I think my brother, the NAACP, is probably going to just fall out of his chair when I say that, because this is what I tell them. It took Black folk 400 years to get to 725. Because slavery was zero. You see what I'm saying, brother? Slavery was zero. We at 725 today. The minimum wage hadn't been raised in 9 years. And so it took 400 years to get to 725. We can't wait another 400 years. There are those that tell us, well, you're going to lose jobs. That's not true, actually. You may lose a few jobs over 10 years, but if you do infrastructure and healthcare and raising the living wage, you're going to add jobs. Because what do poor people do? They don't put their money in the Cayman Islands and Swiss banks. They spend it. And where do they spend it? In businesses. They spend it. And so we have to have this if we're going to talk about real history in this moment. The only way we can honor Black history today is to have just COVID relief, to have health care for everyone, to have a federal minimum wage of 15, which, by the way, is a compromise in and of itself, because truthfully speaking, if we had properly done the indexing for the minimum wage since '68, economists tell us it would be $24 an hour in some places. So we must make sure that we do these things. In order to honor Black history, we must change the way we measure poverty in this country, because the poverty measurement is 55 years too old. And the poverty measurement basically says if you make $12,500 a year, you're not poor. They count you as not being poor. That's not right. It's not even true. We must guarantee affordable housing. That's what Dr. King's Civil Rights Movement and the Poor People's Campaign Fund. We must fight for guaranteed income. We must fight to have, if we want to honor Black history today, we need an infrastructure program that does infrastructure, and particularly the development of green jobs and green infrastructure in Black communities, in minority communities. We must stop massive voter suppression. We just heard last night that that in legislators around this country since this election, legislators have already filed 165 voter suppression bills. 165. And as we sit here today, here's a Black History tidbit, that we've not had the Voter Rights Act since 2013. So for 7 years now, almost 8 years, the United States Congress, United States Senate has refused to fix the Voting Rights Act. So we're headed toward another election where we don't even have what they won 57 years ago when they walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That's not making history, that's going backwards in history. We already know that we lose $1 trillion every year from child poverty. We lose in this culture $2.6 trillion because of lost earnings, because we don't pay people, because of gender and racial wage gaps. We know that COVID is going to ultimately cost $16 trillion. We lost $6.4 trillion in the endless wars that were started in Afghanistan that was more about oil than about protection. We've got to change. We lose $3.5 trillion when we don't address climate change. And look at Texas now. Look at this funny weather. Climate change is real. And environmental injustice hurts Black communities and brown communities first, and poor communities. And so today on this Black History program, what I'm saying is, and what many are saying, is we must use our remembrance of the past to push for transformation in the present. If our foreparents fought for a first Reconstruction and a second Reconstruction, we can do no less than fight for a third Reconstruction. We have to say that to the current administration. We have to push for that in the current Congress. We can't let people, in the name of bipartisan cooperation, which for some people means the good old boys and the good old girls just getting in the back room, slapping high fives and slapping each other on the back and cutting deals on other people's lives. And we can't accept that. We also cannot let people tell us that wanting health care for everybody and wanting living wage for everybody is radical left. You know, it's like it's the radical left. No, it's not. It's right. It's radical right. It's doing what's right. Because if you say that justice is radical, a radical left, if justice is somehow radical left or radical issue, then Frederick Douglass was a radical. Jesus was a radical. Harriet Tubman was a radical. Paul the Apostle was a radical. Fannie Lou Hamer was a radical. Audre Lorde was a radical. Martin King was a radical. A. Philip Randolph, who pushed Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was a radical. And you know what? If that's what being radical is, if being radical means having radical love, if believing the Constitution, establishing justice is radical, if fighting for equal protection under the law is radical, if saying to America, we're not going to let you say one nation under God, individual with liberty and justice for all, just say it and not do it is radical, then so be it. Then Kennedy was radical when he pushed for the Civil Rights Act, and Johnson was radical when he signed the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and Fannie Lou Hamer was radical when she said to America, I question America. It's time for us to have some radical love and some radical justice. All radical means is, a free radical simply means it won't be contained. That's what a free radical is. It's free. It's free. It moves. It won't allow you to lock it in. And guess what? Everything I know about my history, everything I know about Black history says that freedom and the refusal to be limited, the refusal to be put in a corner, the refusal to allow people to put constraints on my humanity, the refusal to be told what I can't do and who I can't be, is a requirement of blackness. It is a requirement of my humanity. And since I'm part Pentecostal, it's a requirement of the Holy Ghost. Because where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. There is freedom. What does it mean to celebrate Black history? It's to not celebrate it. It's to recommit yourself to it. We don't need any more celebrations. What we need is reconsecrations. It means to grab a hold of that history and say in every age, keep your eyes on the prize. It means in every age to say, what do we want? Freedom. When do we want it? Now. How much of it do we want? All of it. It means to refuse to allow anybody to subjugate my humanity. It means to simply say, what does it mean to embrace Black history? It means to say, I not only embrace justice for my people, but for all people. What does it mean, Dr. Kelly? It means to look every injustice in the eye that's trying to enslave my economic possibility, enslave my healthcare possibility, to enslave my environmental justice, that's trying to hold us back. It means to look it right in the eye and say, before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Let us make history because we know history. God bless you.
Dr. Barber. Dr. Barber. Thank you for your words of wisdom, for an educative opportunity to be with you. The movements that you lead and have been a part of literally move me. So many thanks for leading us through such a powerful message. And I would even say a means to hold ourselves accountable, whether we are of African descent or any other descent that you could name. Of course, there have been multiple questions that have come through and comments that have come through. And I know we will not have an opportunity to address each and every one of them, but I do want to get to a couple, given that students have submitted questions, our faculty have submitted questions, members of our Board of Trustees have submitted questions, Lewis University alumni have submitted questions, as has community members, whether they're from the NAACP membership, the National Hookup of Black Women Incorporated, our brothers and sisters from other faiths and so forth. So I know we were allotted until 4, so if part of our audience has to dismiss themselves, thank you for being on with us. We are glad that you spent time with us. But I do want to ask a few questions that have come through. So because a lot of what I do, especially at Lewis, is all about student success, including our students of color, I'm going to start with a question, and some of these you answered throughout your address. One of our students has asked, how do we address secret-laden racism in our workplaces, where people take us seriously when issues are reported? So this is coming from a student by the name of Randy. He wants to know how we address racism in the workplace.
Well, you know, I used to enforce the civil rights laws in North Carolina, employment laws. And you should know that, that the Civil Rights Act of 64, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 64 is about the very question, dealing with racism, sexism, ageism in employment. You should know that any group, corporation, business that gets any assistance from the federal government, i.e., in order for you to do your business, you have to drive on roads that are paid for with federal money. can be held accountable under the Civil Rights Act. Now, too often we've had administrations, presidential administrations and attorney generals like the last one we had, that don't enforce those laws and try to back up, but they're on the books. And so one of the things we have to do with any racism is discover it. You discover it. You don't let it stay hidden. And then the next thing is, when you discover it, you have to depose it. You have to call it out. You have to actually do the work of getting it investigated, whether it's a group of you that do it or yourself. And then after that, you have to deal with it. You have an obligation not to let it remain secret, because it's not having a secret effect. If it's racism, probably somebody knows it. Probably not that secret. And if it's real racism, if it's systemic racism, it's not having a secret impact. It's holding somebody back. Somebody's not advancing like they should. Somebody's not getting what they should receive. And when we talk about it on a day like today, Black History, you know, everybody who we name made history as great historical figures. What makes us name them is that they wouldn't be quiet. They wouldn't just take it. Now, oftentimes in the moment of their contemporary reality, they were not appreciated. It's only after their living. I was reading today, Fannie Lou Hamer wasn't but 59 years old, but she will live for eons. She will live, her spirit will live, because Fannie Lou Hamer, despite her sickness and her diabetes and being beaten, she would not stop questioning. She would not stop discovering racism, deposing racism and dealing with racism. And so wherever you are, whatever job, you have a right to do that. There's no place for systemic racism on the job. And that's not just somebody calling you the N-word. And we have systemic racism is so much more than that. In fact, most of the time today, folk won't call it. And then sometimes people can be engaged in it, and they are truthful. They are actually true when they say they didn't recognize it, because sometimes it's just accepted privilege until somebody calls it out. And then, let me just go ahead and put this on the table, and might make somebody mad. You can't just look at it by color. We got some people that I know that are elected today in Congress that are Black, but in terms of policy, they're just as racist as somebody who is white. Why? Because, for instance, they're Black, but they don't push to restore the Voting Rights Act. That's racism. You know, they're Black, but they won't push to raise the living wage. That's racism. It's not just economics, it's a form of racism. What is racism? Racism is when something that is done or not done has a disparate impact on people because of their color. Whether it's indigenous people, the Latino people, or Black people. That's why when we talk about systemic racism, we talk about it in its totality. In fact, I tell Black people, you can't dismiss the first story, the Native Americans. We can't jump over them and just only want to deal with our racism, because they experienced the racism of America before we did. In fact, they were practiced on. One of the reasons they came and got us. You know, so racism is any time there is an intended or unintended. And you know who said that? Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, of all people, the Republican, said, you can be engaged in racism and not intend it, but in fact, if it produces a racial outcome, it's illegal. That's why in the law, you have categories for both intentional racism, and the legal term is de jure and de facto. You have laws, you can actually prove something is racist, and it was not done overtly, but the impact of the policy, the impact of the action still had a racist impact. And none of it is in line with the fundamental law of the Constitution. There is an amendment in our Constitution that saved it. It's right in the middle of the 26th Amendment, and that is the 14th Amendment. Equal protection under law. If that law was not in the Constitution, I don't know if y'all remember when Donald Trump first got elected, he was suggesting that we take that out and change it. Because if you ever remove equal protection under the law, you can't enforce voting rights, you can't enforce women's rights, you can't enforce labor rights, because equal protection under the law is that's where America was reborn, or the possibility of America was reborn, by that amendment that was passed in 1868, 3 years after the end of the Civil War. And it was passed by fusion black and white coalitions of politicians that said we must guarantee equal protection under the law, and racism is a violation of that protection.
Thank you. And one of the key takeaways is fusion. So this next question comes from one of my colleagues who serves as an administrator at the university. And his question is, do you think that teachers and or professors have a unique role to play in the anti-racism movement? If so, please articulate for us what our role should be.
Well, let me answer like I would in church. Hallelujah, yes. You noticed I opened my lecture today, conversation today, with misnomers, misunderstandings, miseducation about history. And sometimes, I'm gonna be quite honest, when I hear people say certain things, and I'm not suggesting I know so much, because it's so much I don't know, but the little teeny bit I do know, and I'll read about it. If I don't know it, I'll find somebody like Dr. Keller, somebody that does know it. The reality is, I wonder sometimes, who taught these people? Or who mistaught them? You know, Carter G. Woodson talked about the miseducation of the Negro. We need a movement now for the miseducation of America. The miseducation of America. And I wonder who, you know, oftentimes when people are saying some of the things they're saying, the way in which, for instance, just a few weeks ago, 43 senators basically said, you know, the way they justified it and said it wasn't unconstitutional, so forth and so on, even after doing impeachment, even not because I said so, but hundreds of scholars said the opposite. And I listened to them talk, and I was like, what class did they sit in that did not teach them American, true history? You know, how is it that people go through school, for instance? I was in a meeting the other day, and a senator said to me, well, just because waitresses make only $2.13 an hour, that's not a bad thing, because in many places, with tips, they can make $30 an hour. And I said, yeah, maybe the Waldorf Astoria, maybe there, and probably not there. But be that as it may, why would you suggest that $2.13 minimum wage is okay? And they said, well, and the person said, well, you know, it's always been that way. I said, it has not always been that way. That is a direct legacy of post-slavery. When after the Civil War, white business people in the South started paying people. They didn't want to pay them at all, but they said, we're going to make you work for tips as a way of not paying people. Now, I'm from way down yonder in the Paw Paw Patch in North Carolina. I come way, Washington County, pitiful little old school, about 200 folk. But I had some teachers at North Carolina Central University, Duke University, that made sure I knew that history. Yes, administrators and teachers need to teach, because so much of our problem in this country is when you listen on news, you listen to people talk, you listen to the way people debate these issues, either they are just ignorant or they're lying. And a lot of times they're ignorant and lying. But what is it that we're not teaching? What is it that we're not teaching? Because miseducation of a nation continues the failures of that nation. And there was a time, I don't know if you all remember the teacher of, how did we get Thurgood Marshall? We got him because he had a teacher at Howard University and my mind, I'm getting older. Somebody remember it for me right quick. And he was a great lawyer, died young. Come to me in a minute. Come on, mind, work. But he said, as the dean of that law school, it was his job to raise social architects. People who were not just going to school to get a job, but going to school to be taught how to think, and taught how to research, and taught how to make a difference. And yes, we need that in every institute. And you don't have to be one-sided. Teach it all. Teach the truth. You heard me at the beginning. I tried to model that when I said Dr. King, after the Riverside speech, not only were white newspapers against him, not only were racist newspapers against him, but even an institution I love, the NAACP, was against him. We need to know that history. We need to know that there was a rift between Roy Wilkins and Martin King. We need to know that the leaders of the March on Washington were chauvinists. They were good guys, but they were chauvinists. They didn't let any women speak. The one woman that organized, I think she organized 40,000 people to the march, she didn't even come to the mic. We need to know that. We need to know that, and not just history, but economics and sociology and law. Yes, 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 yes. Hallelujah, yes. Teachers have a profound role in our universities and in our colleges to teach people who can be, quote unquote, social architects.
Dr. Barber, my colleague who's a sociologist and who I lean on often, has a message and said that Charles Hamilton Houston.
That's him. That's him. Yeah. CHH, Charles Hamilton Houston. That's exactly. And think about it. Thurgood Marshall wasn't necessarily the best student at first, but Charles Hamilton Houston, when he got into law school, decided that he was going to train up a whole cadre of attorneys that were not just interested in judgeships, but were interested in justice. And because he made that commitment, he didn't even live but that long, Charles Hamilton Houston, but his legacy lived because he didn't sit on the Supreme Court, but he trained the man that would sit on the Supreme Court. Yes, yes, historians and sociologists and political scientists and economists. You know, yes, yes, we need to train and we have a responsibility. I think it's an abdication of our responsibility. And I know that last thing I'll say, because I know we have to. When my father was living, he gave me a quote and was trying to repeat it in its actual form. And it wasn't until after he was dead, my father died at 61, he was a young man. But he, had multiple degrees and knew I would have opportunities. But Francis Bacon said a quote, said, knowledge, and I'm trying to quote it, is not just a porch or a place from which you stand upon and lord over others or call them to serve you, but it is the place from which you serve. That's the paraphrase of it, is the place from which you serve. And we need to train folk that become servants of society, reconstructors of society, architects of society, towards justice, and not just persons who want to go 4 years just to get a job.
Thank you very much. I know we have gone over our time, so I will close us on just a few minimal remarks. Again, much appreciation, Dr. Barber, for being with us today. Literal deference to you from all of us who are on the call and was able to stay on the call a little bit longer. Your insight, your steadfastness on these matters, again, they tug at my heart, and not in the romantical sense, right? But truly for the sake of action. In addition to thanking you, of course, your team has worked with me for a long time. So I just want to thank the Repairs of the Breach team for bearing with me since late last year. to my brother in spirit, Mike Clark at the NAACP and our membership, his membership. I extend gratitude. And the Healing Illinois Racial Justice Grantors, who had the foresight to say, okay, Illinois, we need to respond to our racial unrest. And last, but certainly not least, to my colleagues at Lewis University and our students at Lewis University and guests of the university, I am truly grateful that we have this platform, which is, I know, a very small step in what will continue to need to be done. I am eternally grateful for folks who are here in the struggle, who are here to learn, and who are committed to justice. And so, Mike, if you have any brief remarks, feel free to chime in. But again, Dr. Barber, it is my pleasure and honor to learn from you and to witness the work that you are doing. Mike?
I just want to thank you, Christy, for putting this together and working with us. And Dr. Barber, I've wanted to do this for a long time, so thank you for making time for us, and we're going to get to work.
Thank you. Join us at www Breach Repairs. Everybody that's listening, go there, sign up. You can get our newsletters, tweets, stay informed about the Poor People's Campaign, what's going on. We love to have your insights. We love to have your involvement. We love to have your inspiration.
Thank you very, very much. Have a good night, all.